Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fenske. When the Black Death swept 14th century Florence, wealthy Italians turned to social distancing. One small group's retreat from a plague-ridden city to a deserted villa became the backdrop for the classic novel, The Decameron. Rebecca Messbarger is a professor of Italian at Washington University. She's also co-founder of the university's Medical Humanities program, and The Decameron is one of the key texts in the class that she titled Disease, Madness, and Death Italian Style. So joining us today to talk about it is Rebecca Messbarger of Washington University. Rebecca, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, your academic interests suddenly feel positively ripped from the headlines. Did you expect that when you put together this class on disease, madness, and Italian-style death?
No, absolutely not. I never imagined it would be so pertinent to our day-to-day living and sort of to all of our personal lives. Yeah, this is a complete surprise, not a great surprise.
Yeah, not something you welcome, but here it is. I understand this class is new in this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, I taught it for the first time last year. I taught it the second time this year, and it is my most enjoyable teaching experience, period.
To talk about death and disease and madness, I guess what led you to put this particular combination of topics together?
Well, first of all, it's a perfect subject matter for our medical humanities program. And frankly, Italian literature, all literature, grapples with these themes. I mean, these are themes that are sort of fundamental to human beings. Illness and mental illness and care. They're all things that every single one of us is going to have to grapple with in our lifetimes. And it's, a subject of literature and history and philosophy. So there's just ample material. In the Italian context, it's very rich. Those are subjects that are all over the place.
Now, as I mentioned in that little intro up there, one of the major texts is the Decameron. And for those of us who are not up to speed in our 14th century Italian literature, tell us, what is this book about?
So the Decameron is actually a set of 100 tales, bawdy, humorous, moral, tragic, and they're wrapped together inside an actual historical frame. So Giovanni Boccaccio was a medieval writer from Florence. He had a background in business. His father was a merchant. He was, he lived a full life, and he actually lived firsthand the 1348 plague that decimated Florence. More than half of the people in Florence died.
More than half? That's stunning.
Stunning. Yeah. And so, anyway, that is the frame, the backdrop, the rationale for bringing 10 young, noble men and women, 7 women, 3 men, together to escape this devastation and chaos and retreat to a villa and retreat from death. And they join together and they sit in the shade and they tell stories to kind of take their minds off of what they've experienced and to bide their time until they can go back to a safe Florence.
And I know the focus of this is these stories, not necessarily the fate of these characters and how they grapple with the plague. But do we know, does their social distancing save them?
We don't really know what happens when they go back to Florence, but we can assume that they probably have a good end. Even though, the overarching theme of the Decameron is fortune. How your fortune rises and falls in this life. And I think some of us are looking at what's currently happening in those terms as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say fortune. I imagine these characters are fortunate just being able to get to a deserted villa in Florence or outside Florence. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of us would like to be doing our quarantining in a place like this. Is that sort of addressed at all in these stories?
Yeah, Boccaccio really takes on the whole question of who gets to socially distance and who doesn't in this. And, of course, this is a very privileged group that, let's go. Pompinea is the leader of the group. She's the woman, and she says, essentially, let's get out of here and take ourselves to the country and there live on one of our estates. So, yeah, they're very, very privileged. And most of Florence doesn't have that option. Just like most of our own fellow citizens don't have the option to simply retreat until things get better.
And so many of us right now are sort of dealing with the downside of social distancing and, feeling cut off or alienated. Does this book deal at all with that aspect of what these characters could be going through?
Well, it deals with this very directly. I mean, Boccaccio talks about bad social distancing. There's constructive social distancing, and there's really destructive social distancing that where people abandon each other, where people are isolated, where people are ostracized. And in fact, a colleague of mine in Italy published in Italian today an article on the whole notion of quarantine. Quarantine is actually a Venetian word, and it goes back to leper colonies, putting the impure and the unclean, exiling them essentially. And so Boccaccio he's very critical of doctors who abandon their patients and fathers and mothers who abandon their children, which he witnesses in this calamity. So. Yeah, he talks about this, and it is something that we also have to contend with. When any group is made culpable for an illness like this, I really find terms like the China flu or the Wuhan flu incredibly destructive, and Boccaccio calls that out. When he published this in 1353.
Wow. I mean, it just seems like such a relevant book on so many levels. I mean, this must be almost just blowing your mind, seeing all these places where it relates to what we're dealing with now.
I think it is, and I think it also has some good advice for us, to gather and tell stories. What he does with the stories is he recreates society through fiction. And, we're all engaging in social media in our own narrative about what we're experiencing. I mean, certainly the people I know are on social media a lot talking about their daily life, and that kind of connection and commiseration and storytelling is crucial in a time that's really difficult.
So we can gather for these storytelling without having to actually gather physically.
Yeah, and if you'll permit me, I'm now not able to teach my students anymore. I'm not able to see my colleagues anymore. And, I just would love to say to them, I hold you close even though we are at a physical distance. So you can be close. You can express all kinds of solidarity and good feeling without being, less than 6 feet from people.
Yeah, I think that's important to note. I mean, we all just maybe feel a bit isolated right now, but there's maybe ways to overcome that. We have some technologies that they didn't have in 14th century Florence.
That's right. I mean, I am sure there are plenty of people feeling, the emotional strain of isolation. I've heard about I have friends whose parents, particularly, I'm in contact almost daily with people in Italy. And in the hardest hit areas, you've got a lot of elderly people who are all alone. And that emotional isolation can be really devastating and has been described as producing PTSD effects. So, the more we can reach out in whatever way possible that, doesn't put anyone at harm, the better.
Mm-hmm. We're talking to Rebecca Messbarger. She's a professor of Italian at Washington University and also co-founder of the university's Medical Humanities program, talking about just how timely her interests are in this moment that we're in today. And I know you have a number of colleagues and people that you know who are on the ground in Italy, as you just mentioned there. Overall, are they able to keep their spirits up as they're dealing with some real restrictions on their movement?
It is really a dire situation for many parts of Italy. I think that, we've seen how Italians are connecting. I think many of us have seen them singing across to their neighbors from their balconies and playing musical instruments. And I just saw Venice, the Veneto has been hit pretty hard, and an opera singer singing to all of his neighbors. But it is a really tough situation, and the lockdown. My husband's cousin is in security. He's a civil servant, and I just had him describe to me, and it's very pretty severe. You're not even supposed to take a walk.
That's
police are out saying go home, and because they really have to restrain this infection. As much for the hospitals and the medical personnel, just the whole medical system, because it is really in dire shape in certain places.
Do you think that social practices played a role in things getting this so out of control in Italy? I mean, we all have our stereotypes of what Italians are like with the kissing but I know you actually know this culture. Do you think that was a factor?
Well, I do think that, Italians, obviously there's an Italian countryside, but Italy is fairly dense in its living. People live in apartments. They live in a really close proximity. Your social gathering places are really your extended family. So certainly the way people live in Italy is highly social. It's what I love about Italy. And I don't know that there have been studies of this. The issue of how transmission takes place is still being studied by our scientists and our medical researchers. And I mean, it is really interesting to compare sort of Korea and Italy. There's now a lot of statistics looking at these two places and containment.
That's an excellent point. And, until we know exactly how this is spreading, it's hard to do too much conjecture. But it does seem like the very thing that we love about Italy, those close packed cities, that makes it really hard for them to fight this. And maybe in St. Louis, the things that are sometimes annoying about the city, our emptiness, might actually work in our favor. It's crazy to think of that. Now,
it is funny. I was asking Italians, how do you think Giuseppe Conte is doing, who is their prime minister? And Italians, the many people that I've talked to think he's doing a great job by sort of taking firm central control over the situation. And I've heard from a lot of people saying, we're so glad that he's telling people to go home because the other side of Italian life is just a kind of negotiation of all rules. All rules are sort of negotiable. Anybody who's ever driven in Italy knows a stop sign can mean a stop sign or maybe not. And so they're really glad that he's kind of corralling everybody and getting everybody to do what they're supposed to do.
Now, overall, this course that we mentioned, this disease, madness, and death Italian style, you're looking at 7 centuries of illness and care in Italy, not just the Decameron. I'm wondering, what are some of the other takeaways from this course that give you some insight into this moment that we're in now?
Well, if we go back to this other notion of bad social distancing, some of the major bestsellers are all about disease, madness, and death. Alessandro Manzoni wrote a book that we've translated into English as The Betrothed. It's I Promessi Sposi in Italian. And it was a mega bestseller in the 19th century. And it talks, again, about a 1630 plague. And this one, much like today in Italy, was centered in Lombardy. And the story takes place in Lombardy. But what ends up happening is how people take care of each other or how people ostracize and blame each other. And there's a central historical moment in the novel, and I recommend it to you. It's a great novel. We should all be reading this novel again today.
And tell our listeners again the name of this particular novel you're recommending.
It's called The Betrothed.
Okay.
And it's just about these two young people who are poor, who are in love, and kind of their love story. They get lost in the midst of this terrible plague and eventually find each other. It's a very important book for American Catholics because there's a sort of Catholic central motif there. But in the middle of this, and this is historical, in 1630, two men were blamed for the plague in Milan. And even though government officials knew they were not responsible, they were tortured publicly and brutally executed. And a stone column was put in the place where their home was burned to the ground, and it was called the Column of Infamy. And it sat there for, more than 100 years. And it really is a column of infamy about the wrong approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's some crazy scapegoating there.
Yes. And that's what I hope we resist. We just have to resist that.
That's a great point. It's also interesting, though. I mean, as you say, there's so many of these texts through the years that are dealing with plagues. And it's interesting how we think of ourselves as being in this more enlightened time, or that we've solved all these problems, science has fixed things. And yet this is kind of just the way that life has been for so long. It continues even today, despite how we think we've solved everything. We haven't.
Right. And, I think one of the things that I thrill to, and I know my children do, is how connected we are. And I really hope this doesn't increase barriers between us because, honestly, the whole world is going through this right now. We are all going to confront this. Our world is going to change. And we really need to come together. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think the St. Louis response to the 1918 influenza is such an important model that just keeps being cited in, I love the fact that it's on the news every day, the 1918 influenza, and St. Louis's model response, coming together, working together, and saving lives as a result.
Being willing to shut things down, even if it's something that people would want to go to. You feel like that's a key takeaway from that 1918 moment.
Well, and I also think the leadership was so thoughtful and strategic. Truth, transparency, and teamwork really, I think, defined how Max Starkloff and the mayor, Henry Keel, operated in 1918. There was a lot of opposition from the business community, from the school system, the superintendent of schools, from the churches, from the archbishop, about closing everything down. But he brought them all together and said, look at these numbers, look at what's happening. And people agreed. And so that, that I think really saved lives. And so everybody got on board and said, yes, we have to do it. I see that happening right now in St. Louis. I see, our officials really starting to take this seriously and making these hard decisions. And they are hard.
Yeah. And and as you say this, I mean, it all, as you say, there's these lessons from 1918, there's these lessons from the 14th century, and I just hope we're wise enough to take the good counsel that is out there in the historic record. So, Rebecca Messbarger, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I loved it. Thank you so much, Sarah.
And Rebecca is a professor of Italian at Washington University. She's also a founder of the university's medical humanities program. And that book she recommended is The Betrothed. If anyone's looking for some good reading material while they're at home, you heard it from Rebecca Messbarger. This is a great book we should all be reading. So thanks to her for her insights. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. That's 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer, St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on The Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.